Hi, and welcome to Omnibus Roundtable, covering civic and political affairs in Chicago. I'm your host, Renee, and today we're talking with Don Samuelson. Don, you've been involved in subsidized housing for 40 years. In one capacity or another, you had your own portfolio of properties. What brought you to Englewood and Englewood Terrace?
Have I really been doing this for 40 years? I seem so young looking. Yeah, what brought me to Englewood? That's the question. Well, I had just finished managing Stateway Gardens through its process of demolition, where we took 8 buildings and reduced them to 7, then to 4, then to 2. And that got me a first-hand exposure into the world of gangs and drugs and crime and dysfunctionality. So I had been comfortable with being able to deal with things before that I'd never dealt with quite at that level of complexity. And so I was familiar with the problems, but I was frustrated by my inability of actually controlling the solution because the CHA was the owner and I was simply the management agent, so I was limited in what I could do.
How did the dynamic change with you as owner as opposed to manager?
Well, you spend the money and you have control of the purse strings, which is a big difference. And so that with ownership of New Englewood Terrace, I knew that it was the same sort of turnaround situation that I was familiar with before. It involved family housing in a high-rise, which I was familiar with at Stateway and some other projects. And by being able to develop and manage the management, overall planning, and resident services programs, I was able to keep all those 3 sections integrated without necessarily having to look to other parties to participate.
So it seemed like a great opportunity to illustrate what could be done in low-income housing.
Yeah, I didn't think that gangs and drugs were impossible problems. I mean, I found dealing with the gangs at Stateway to be dealing with businessmen, essentially. Their interest was in staying low and not getting visible and not having themselves on the news. So it was not particularly difficult to deal with them as regular people. More difficult to deal with bureaucrats rather than the gang and drug interests, actually. So in addition to being in control, there was a planning process going on in Englewood at that time that struck me as being very promising. Kennedy King College had just put up a $250 million community college across the street from what was then South Point, then we named it New Englewood Terrace. There was the Kershaw School directly across the street. That was a primary school where 2/3 of the students were from the building. So you now have a building of 300 units with about 1,000 residents that had their own primary school, essentially, and access to a community college. That's a very strong set of coincidences. In addition to that, you had a access to the Englewood Green Line is on Halsted, so which was about a block away. So you had public transportation a block away, across the street to the community college, a private primary school across the street, and the ability of controlling it into a controlled experiment. So that struck me as having all the stars were aligned to make for what could have been a very successful project.
So what was it that the stars were aligned for? What is it really that you wanted to accomplish that was different than what you were able to accomplish as a manager with CHA?
Well, over the 40 years, as you remind me, that I've been involved with government housing, it seemed to me that the issue was not so much the housing itself, not the shelter, but making contact with your residents and getting a sense of their whole family needs, not just their shelter needs. And this gives me the opportunity of experimenting with the use of things like an on-site computer learning center, a concierge that would connect the residents to the community resources of Englewood, and to put broadband into the building so that we could have the opportunity of efficiencies in security and energy. We were spending $35,000 a month on armed guards at New Englewood Terrace.
Wow.
That's about 35, that's $420,000 a year. That's 1/5 of the overall rental income. Normally, security would be 1/10 or 1/20 of the cost of operations.
By normal, you mean in non-subsidized housing?
Well, not just non-subsidized housing, in situations where we were not engaged in keeping the peace in a Afghanistan, Iraq-like situation. So this was sort of nation building, but nation building as it relates to security could have been taken care of through surveillance cameras, through recognition, eyeball recognition, hand recognition. There were things that we could have done with the security system that would dramatically reduce the cost of the operation of the building, and that was what the plan was. And so I was hopeful that we could demonstrate that in 2001, and by now we would have had an example of how these projects or developments like this could be done all over the country. And as you may know, Renee, the stimulus package of President Obama is really trying to promote these sorts of things. So they're now 10 years later saying we should bring broadband to low-income individuals, low-income families. They have a demonstration project in San Diego called C2C, Connect to Compete.
Yes.
The idea being that you will create computers in the unit so that the parents, the grandparents, and the children all have access to the internet. We would have done that in 2002.
Putting an entirely different face on public housing.
Yes, yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little
Let's
bit ahead of my
continue with
time.
that. Yeah, let's continue with that in the next segment.